Guys, so this is about what we're talking about today is college applications in an era of test optional admissions, which is a new phenomenon in the grand scheme of things. And if we're thinking about it as a longer term horizon for a framework, it is a short term thing if you are, or longer term. It has been occurring for a while in a much more, and from the perspective of your students' lives, which they've been living mostly, or in large part, their high school career has been dominated or governed entirely by test optional regimes. So I have a lot to say, and I want to move relatively quickly. We also potentially, one of our students is going to be potentially saying some things about test optional too, so that for the recording, that would be useful for some parents and for some students. I'm going to go through this quickly. How to use the Krupnick approach. I mean, we have four different elements, really three different primarily. They're requirements, discovery, strategy, and positioning. And financial aid is a new part of our framework, of way of thinking about the world. And today we're going to be talking mainly about what have historically been called requirements, which are these ACT, SATs, which are now optional. I'm trying to make sense of what that actually means, to kind of get beyond the politics, the sound and fury of sort of rhetoric and framing and presentation, to actually think about what this might mean in practice for your student. In saying that, I want to just say, of course, disclaimer that we do run a test prep company, but we run also a college prep, fully integrated college prep service. So we have 93% of our students as part of our college acceptance program are accepted into at least one of their top three schools. Our average students are improving by 7 points on the ACT and by 250 points on the SAT, which even in a test optional world, well, actually, maybe especially a test optional world means a lot. I have four things I wanted to talk through, and going to move through these things quickly, to see and to try to make some sense of demystify this very confusing, complex terrain. And it's complex, I think, for everyone. I mean, it's complex not only for us and for the students and for the parents, but it's complex also for the colleges. And that's something that I want to touch on a little bit. So the first step, so we have standardized test prep and started our standardized tests in 2023 and beyond. Why colleges are test optional. What does test optional mean for you or your parent, or you as someone applying, and then generating a test optional prep and application strategy, which I think could be potentially the most fruitful. But the prolegomena, the prefatory notes, are important in order to get to that place, to be able to think about how we sort of strategize our way through what all of this is. Okay, so the landscape. This is the landscape right now. It's the landscape as things will look probably in the next few years, with a little bit of moving back and forth among these different under these different headings. There really are, so there are 5 different types of testing environments, testing policies out there for colleges. And for the most part, really there are only 3 in practice that are instituted with any degree of regularity and reliability. The most lax is the most sort of anti-test, or the least important, the policies that place the least importance on standardized tests is test blind, which means that test blind schools like the University of California system, which don't actually look at test scores at all. So from their perspective, tests are irrelevant. If you included a score on a California application, they would not look at it, or it would be seen as just a 3-digit number without any meaning, or a 2-digit number if you're doing ACT. The second mode would be test optional, and that's where most of the world is right now. So 80% of 4-year colleges are test optional right now. 85% of the top schools in the top 100, 130, and I think our guidance is that might actually, well, I'll probably stay the same for a while, because there are some schools that are test required, but test conditional and test flexible are 2 of the other possibilities. Test conditional is a very unusual. This is more common pre-2020, where they'll say to you, that you can submit a test, but you have to be above a certain level, certain GPA requirement or threshold. If so, in order to be exempt from a test. So there's certain conditions on which being able to not submit a test would be satisfied. Test flexible is that you can substitute another test for ACT, SAT. Most of the world doesn't exist with this way. Test required is schools, like a few schools are still requiring tests. The real bias is Southern schools are more likely to require the test. So there's Southern schools are more likely to take the test seriously. MIT has come back into the game requiring tests. Virginia Tech, a few others. So there's about 80% right now of the colleges in America are test optional, and about 20% are test required, leaving a 0% rounding error for the test conditional, test blind, and test flexible schools, which is to say it's not actually zero, but it rounds down to zero. All right, let's go to the meat of this. Why are colleges test optional? Why do they have? Why does this policy? Why was this policy ever set into motion? Especially if it's so confusing for everyone. So the myth or the mythology about test optional is that it was a response to COVID because of shutdowns at test centers and fears that people would get, infected in a small room, which of course was a proximate cause, right? It was the occasion, but not the cause of test optional proliferation. In other words, test optional, the language that colleges are using now, this is not simply a continuation of COVID. I mean, the language has changed structurally, and that's important. And what I want to suggest about that is the fact that the language has changed suggests that this was an opportunity the colleges were either looking for, or that at the very least it is an opportunity the colleges have been able to benefit from, and they benefit from them in ways beyond that are actually fairly straightforward, but that are important to be articulated. So how do we know that COVID was the occasion but not the cause? Well, for one thing, because test optional policies predated COVID. There were hundreds of schools, I think 300 schools or so, that were already test optional or test flexible before 2020. Bowdoin College, I believe, went test optional. It was the first school to do it in 1969. And many of the other small liberal arts colleges followed suit. And then between 2005 and 2010, that you saw schools like Colby College and Swarthmore, places like that, becoming test optional. Then other schools went test optional before 2020. There's another wave between 2010 and 2020, where schools like NYU and UChicago, American, Franklin Marshall, Marquette, and hundreds of others, literally hundreds of others. Some of them made the news, the NYU and UChicago did. I think Wake Forest also made the news, but it was the number of schools that were test optional before the pandemic was actually, it was 15% of the overall, school, the 4-year population. So it wasn't, there was always already happening. So here's an alternative. This is the alternative, and this is really the real sort of reason for test optional, at least as far as why test optional is so dominant right now. Because in theory, of course, everybody could have gone right back to being test required, right? So test optional is ultimately a response to social and economic inequality and opportunity. That's fundamentally what it is. And the reality, of course, is that unlike, so many students just don't have access to the sorts of resources that other parents do to be able to help prepare for these tests. So there's a quotation from the University of Pittsburgh's admissions page. A large number of schools are using the language of diversity and inclusion as part of their test optional explanatory framework. But University of Pittsburgh, they actually say it very explicitly, right? Because test optional admissions helps to level the playing field for students who can't afford or lack access to tutoring and test prep companies. Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, that's we also run a nonprofit. We have a 501c3 with which we help to students who are less or lower income students, largely minority students from Chicago public school system who would not have access in the way that Pittsburgh is suggesting. And we provide a full apparatus of the same, actually it's exactly the same. It's identical elite test prep and college prep service to these students, 50 students a year, approximately. And so we're actually working on the other side. We're working on the side to make, instead of making, because there's another alternative to this, rather than making tests optional or make them blind, you give more people opportunities, right? So rather than sort of pushing down, you raise up. The kind of the Harrison Bergeron sort of notion, right? That's the kind of college perspective. Rather, as opposed to trying to uplift, which is what we're trying to do. And I think it's obviously we can't do it alone, but that there's a whole there's a group of people who are doing that as part of the movement to allow, I think, just give kids more access. So this is a big part of this. Now, most of the other colleges use more veiled language, more coded language. So Amherst, says that recognizing standardized tests cannot fully capture the many facets of diverse applications or applicants. We carefully consider all components in a contextual depiction, right? So contextual is a keyword, diverse is a keyword. So this is the world we're living in, right? In which there are these sort of buzzwords. There are words that are code for opportunity and inequality of opportunity. And what's striking about it is that Pittsburgh is one of the few schools that is actually explicit about it. I'm not sure why students or why colleges feel the need to not be explicit about it. It's actually that says something about our culture. I think it's maybe not the greatest thing. But another thing, so you have Princeton, notoriously very politically savvy places, Princeton and Amherst. Standardized testing is only one element of our comprehensive and holistic application process. Princeton has no minimum score. It's considered in context. Again, in context being the key word there. All right, that's the first part. Now, there's more evidence of that, but that's probably not why you're listening. What you're listening for is, I'm imagining, this is not a sociology lecture as much as despite my background in sociology, but you're listening, the reason you're here is to think about whether or not, what test optional means for you. Like, do you take the test? Do you do test prep? Do you submit the test after you've done test prep? So those are sort of the three phases, right? Do you want to take the test in the first place? Is it worth doing test prep? And once you've done test prep, or if you don't do test prep, do I submit the tests to colleges, or how do I think about that? So that's what we're going to attempt to answer here and think about. So first, what I want to suggest is that there are a set of thresholds that are very concrete and that are very well established, that suggest that scores do matter. Now, do they matter as much as they mattered in 2019? I don't know. I think for some people they do, and for some people they don't. And I guess that's part of the idea here. So Yale and a number of schools have come out very straightforwardly. MIT is actually the most conspicuous to say that the ACT, SAT scores do matter. Yale says here, so applicants who have successfully completed one or more ACT or SAT exams should consider including scores, even if those scores are below the ranges listed below. The ranges listed below the 25 to 75 scale, so the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. Yale's internal research has consistently shown that, I think it should be showed, I don't think shown is actually technically right. Standardized test scores are a significant predictor of a student's undergraduate academic performance. Very interesting to come out and say that directly. Harvard says the same thing. Harvard says that SAT and ACTs are better predictors of Harvard grades than high school grades are predictors of Harvard grades. MIT, our ability to accurately predict student academic success is significantly improved by considering standardized tests. Duke, this sounds like satire, but it's real. Buy a study guide and begin taking practice SAT and ACT tests. It's actually on their website, believe it or not. Combination of standardized tests, Northwestern says, and grades has shown to be a strengthening predictive models for academic performance in college. So, in other words, colleges are not sitting there and saying that. When you want to visit and talk to colleges and ask them whether you should submit scores, there will be a range of answers, but often you get a sort of a kind of a kind of sort of Norman Rockwell, very kind of sort of blandly upbeat American kind of response, which is, we consider everyone, and we want you to give you have as many opportunities as possible, and we strongly encourage you, no matter who you are, and what your scores are, or your grades, or any of the other factors about you, to apply to our schools. Well, of course, that's what they say in the front end, and I'm not suggesting that that's disingenuous, but it also should be set against the backdrop of the fact that at the back end, these are schools that admit, Stanford, for example, but it's 3% of its applicants, right? Harvard accepts 3 or 4% of its applicants, and most colleges, to which I think a number of the viewers here will be applying, accept well under 50%. In some cases, far lower than 50%. I think there are 25 schools now that accept lower than 10% of the applicants, which is really extraordinary. That's that's unprecedented. In any case, the rule of thumb that we would give, the threshold, is that if you are at the 25th percentile or above for a given college on the ACT or SAT, if your score is at the 25th percentile or above on the ACT or SAT, that you should submit your scores. So if you are anywhere from, this is a bell curve, right? So that there's a bottom 25%, a top 25%, in the middle 50. So if you're above that bottom 25% for the college to which you are applying, you should submit. That's the guidance that we've gotten from the colleges. That's the guidance that we've gotten from the rest of the consulting world. That's the guidance we get from the counselors, and that's the guidance that we share to our students as well. Now, there is an interesting paradox here, which is that if it is true that the 25th percentile is the threshold, if it's true that you should submit above the 25th percentile to these colleges, and by 25th percentile, there, you can look up the 25th percentile on any Google website or Google search. It's the 25-75 band. So if Carnegie Mellon says that it's 32 to 35, right? Like the 25th percentile is 32. But there's a paradox here, right? Which is that if everyone knows that the 25th percentile is the threshold, if colleges know the 5th percentile is the threshold, and if they're giving the advice that the 25th percentile is the threshold, then they very well should know the 25th percentile will be the threshold at which a lot of students will be thinking about this process. Then it is the case, if colleges know this, it is the case that if we can assume that colleges treat essentially all test optional students the same way in terms of their score. So let's say you're Carnegie Mellon and someone doesn't submit, let's say you assume everyone got a 29, right? Well, what they're essentially doing is they're taking all the students who didn't apply or didn't submit, and they're taking the average of what they think those students would have scored, which amounts not to the 25th percentile, but amounts to the 12.5 percentile. In other words, if they treat everyone as test optional exactly the same way in terms of what that means about their test, then, in other words, they're blind to it, so they don't know, then it is the case that if you are above the middle of the bottom 25th percentile, which is where you would be treated if you don't submit, then it actually behooves you to submit, right? So then we have a world, let's say there's a new incarnation, new cohort or whatever. Now it's the 12.5 percentile becomes the new threshold. Well, now the same process happens again and again, right? So now if everybody knows that 12.5 percentile is the threshold, then the group of students who are above the middle of that bottom of that 12.5% will want to submit as well, because they don't want to be perceived as being below the average or at the average of that 12.5 percentile. So in other words, this becomes like Zeno's paradox, where it goes asymptotically to zero. And I'm not actually suggesting that this means that no one should submit, but it's an interesting thought experiment. And there is this kind of game theoretical quality to this process, which is to say that when you're making decisions about whether to submit, you're not just thinking about whether or not you meet some sort of absolute threshold, right? You're thinking about what other students are going to also do and how other colleges are going to perceive what other students do and what you do. So this is the sort of Einstein versus Newton debate, right? Like it's no benchmark because everything else is moving at the same time. So these numbers are all relative. And so you have to take into consideration, I mean, if you want to be really strategic about this, you kind of have to take into consideration what other people might be doing, or you have to at least imagine your way into their minds. Well, all right, abstract as that may be, here are some concrete statistics. Well, so it turns out that there's a 1.8 to 1 rule. What is 1.8 to 1 rule? Well, submission increases your odds by about 80%. So if you take your odds at a school, let's say your odds are 20% of getting it, right? Well, if you submit, your odds would be about 36%. And this is on average. And this is also a very, very crude estimate because some of these schools are vastly different. So Boston College, your odds of getting in are 2.7 times as high as they are if you submit, if you don't submit. Emory, it's 2.7 times. Georgetown, Georgetown actually is not a test required, so that's not. Notre Dame, it's 2 times. University of Virginia is 1.9 times. Tufts is 1.5 times. But there are schools where it's closer to parity. Northeastern, it was exactly the same. Swarthmore, it was pretty close. Tufts, very close. So you have to think of this as being it operates within a range, but the 1.8 is the average. The other thing, of course, is that it may not be the case that students who submit are identical to students who don't submit. So in other words, students who do submit may also be more likely to get in, even independent of their scores. They might be better students. They might have other qualities that make them more eligible for admissions than the students who don't submit. So that is not a causal claim, although the causality is suggested a little bit by the language. It is a descriptive claim, but it's definitely descriptive. It's a sufficiently robust descriptive claim that I think it has to be taken seriously. Next is, I think, unless there are any sort of thoughts here, questions, I think the real question here, I think, for people is what do you do about this, right? What do you do about test optional, and how can you generate an actual strategy? So, I mean, I've thrown out a few ideas, but I mean, we don't know, like I talk about, how you have to treat it all as relative and you have to be thinking about the strategies that other people are going to employ. It's a very kind of unrealistic. I mean, first of all, that requires a lot more time than anybody actually has to be able to think that through, or to actually be, to question people on that. But secondly, is that those are things that you just won't know. You won't ever be able to get to the bottom of that, because even if you use a theoretical model, even if you're a mathematician, people don't always operate on the basis of mathematical laws or rules, and certainly as economists know, there are a lot of ways in which economic theory, which is what this would kind of be part of sort of behavioral economics, does not actually capture what people do in when they surrender to the forces of nature and reality. So there are some strategies that you can use, and these are the things that I would suggest using. These are some of the things I would be thinking about. This kind of thing. One is that you take the test seriously and you use the test as a hedge. In other words, in an environment where you don't know who the other applicants will be, how they will evaluate admissions, which applications, which kinds of criteria will become more important in which years, you can hedge against uncertainty with good test scores, right? Or with test scores in general, to minimize the downside. Second is you can use these tests to increase your admissions odds, to actually increase your odds. So the second is to protect against not getting in, and the second is to increase your odds of getting in. Now, this is the point we're just making, that if the odds are 1.8 times as high, that you'd be accepted if you submit. Then if you don't submit, then you organize yourself around submitting. Third is that you could use test scores as a way to take pressure off of other areas of the application, or if there are gaps in your application. So part of the challenge with test optional is that it means that the rest of your application has to be extraordinary. I mean, it means that you have to have either a hook, one of the 3 conventional hooks, like you have a you're a disadvantaged minority, or you're a legacy donor, you're an athlete, or it means you have to have your own internally generated hook, like, you happen to be the best chess player in the state or something, right? You have to have some unusual qualities at the top school, not necessarily at all of the schools, but at a lot of them. The fourth thing is that you can use test scores for some of your schools, but not for others. So in other words, you have a list of targets, safeties, and reaches, and you don't have to, you apply to different schools for a reason, right? And you apply with different parts of your application that are being positioned in different ways at different schools for a reason. And you can think of the ACT and SAT in the same way. It's just like, that, at the business, if you apply to the business school at Indiana, you're going to want to say more about your finance background than if you apply to arts and sciences at Illinois, right? So it's the same sort of thing here, that for the test scores, you might consider that if you meet the 25th percentile in some of your schools, in fact, you probably should meet the 25th percentile in some of your schools, or else there's a risk that you're applying to, even your safeties are maybe are a little bit a little bit riskier than you might think. If you meet the 25th percentile for some of your schools, but not all of them, you submit for the 25th percentile, the schools to which which you meet the 25th, that threshold. You submit at those schools and you don't submit at others, and you see what happens. That's what a lot of our students wind up doing. That's actually what I think that's probably the case for most of our students, even who've done a lot of ACT prep, if they apply to some really, really challenging safeties. So, for example, if you're applying to a lot of schools, you apply to MIT, right? Actually, MIT's test requires. That actually does not really an example we can really offer here. But if you're applying to Princeton, right, and there's a 33 to 35, let's say let's say it's a 34 to 36 threshold, right? 34 is your threshold. Well, if you get a 33 and you're up 10 points on the ACT, you still might not submit. But you would have a whole range, 15, 20 schools at which you still probably would submit. And so that's a strategy. And I think that's a useful strategy. I think that one of the things that means is that the traditional process, this is sort of more speculative, and I don't think this is necessarily something that everyone would immediately want to embrace, like just sort of at first glance. But there's a sort of argument here, maybe, and we think about this a lot, that the old paradigm was that you go to school, you start high school, you take the PSAT, gives you a sense of kind of what kind of classes you should be taking. You should be taking more AP classes. Do well, maybe you should be on these, do well on these tests, maybe it means you'll be taking harder classes, that sort of thing. And then you take the SAT or ACT, and then that score provides guidance for you about where you should be applying. That's the traditional model. Now, what this suggests, what test optional suggests, the existence of test optional policy suggests, and the increasing differentiation of schools from each other is another feature of American life, which also would suggest this, that it suggests that there's an argument for thinking about where you want to go to college and having a list made, and maybe doing college visits, and maybe refining that list before you have your scores, because of the idea that if you know where you're going, if you know where you want to go, you know what kind of schools you're looking at, you know what your target range is, and you know whether or not, for example, it's even worth doing prep. So, for example, let's say you have a 4.3 or something, right? And you want to go to Georgetown. No, again, it's another test required school. So there are some schools that are test required. That's an important point. You want to go to Penn. All right, well, your odds of getting into Penn, anyone's odds of getting into Penn are going to be low. But let's say that's the case, you're 4.3, you want to go to Penn, maybe you're early in your junior year. That is an important thing in thinking about, important feature when we're thinking about these test scores, right? Because if you take a PACT and you get a very low score on the PACT, you might consider that you might say very early on that you're going to be test blind or you're going to be test optional at Penn. You might decide right out of the gates that you are not going to take the test seriously, at least for Penn. Right. So this is a different model, and this is a model that in which the knowledge about these schools can actually enter into the process a little earlier than they have. And I think the knowledge about these schools has entered into the process earlier and earlier as over the past 15, 20 years, as students have become more and more savvy and sophisticated about this whole process. But there's a strategic reason now for this. Now, of course, on the other hand, there's the fact that, there's what we've just been talking about, right? So you may know you want to go to Penn, but you may also know that you've got 15 other schools to which you would like to apply. Well, again, though, it will be useful to know which those schools are, because if you know which schools those are, then you know where you should be shooting in terms of that 25th percentile. And if you know where you should be shooting in terms of that 25th percent or the 50th percentile, that also helps you determine when is a reasonable time to stop. When is it okay to not take the test again? What super score is sufficient for you to be able to say, okay, I am in the game here at most of my colleges or all of the colleges or a certain percentage of the colleges, so that I don't have to keep taking this test. That's an important consideration. I'm not sure. I mean, there are so many features that are moving around, and there's so many parts of this that are changing. So it's hard to make that sort of endorsement as a general rule, as a suggestion that it be a general rule. But it is something to think about. The rule of thumb on this more generally is that the better you do on these tests, I mean, this is the sort of the biggest takeaway of all really is, the better you do on these tests, the more opportunities you have. I mean, that's been the thesis really here, that in the absence of knowing precisely the criteria by which they will be judging students this year, and in the absence of in the absence of very many objective criteria by which they have to measure people other than students' grades, which are of course somewhat unreliable because the combination of grade inflation that's become more common and school differences, and simply because of the sort of the recommendations of these colleges themselves, some of whom make the point very clearly that tests matter a lot, right? They take tests seriously. And Harvard says that tests are a better predictor of Harvard grades than GPA is. It's not to say they value it more, but it's to say it's better, at least more predictive of GPA. Providing more opportunities is never a bad thing. So I think I'll leave you with that sort of as a general rule. I hope that some of this has been satisfying at the level of helping to demystify a process which is really, for all intents and purposes, deliberately intended to mystify you. And by that I mean that, sort of this point that we started with, that there's a front end and a back end to this college process, that the front end is where you show up and you visit and the colleges advertise themselves to you. The back end is the admissions, like whether you get in or not. Well, it's like any business, right? Where there's going to be a real attempt. They're going to make a very, very aggressive attempt to encourage as many people to apply as possible. It's in their interest economically. It's in their interest as a school for their cultural purposes. It's in their interest in every sort of way imaginable. It'll help their rankings. And so there's incentive for the colleges to be as vague as possible on some of these things. And my suspicion is that there will be even more incentive for colleges to be as vague as possible on college admissions and on test optional for policies and what tests mean as we go forward. We're already seeing that with the explosion of this word holistic admissions, which had already been again in the vernacular, but it's really become central to it now, which is very sort of unclear, right? Deliberately, right? So the reason I say that is because, well, mean, there are a lot of reasons to say that, but one reason is that I think there's a reasonable sort of argument that, especially for private schools, that private schools like justly want to be able to accept the people they want to accept. They want to have a diverse class, and they want to allow students who've not had the same advantages compete against or come to their school. Because for colleges, the goal of accepting students of a student where you get accept the purpose of college from a college's perspective, and the reason they accept you is not only that you're going to be academically, you're not going to be academically excellent. It is actually just primarily, number one, they want to accept students who will contribute to the school, right? Socially, intellectually, economically, in all ways. Two is they want to have a class in which you fit in. The students all fit in. They are integrate into a coherent and structurally sound, solidary class, right? That's what a community is. So that's important. Now, what we're getting at here is that colleges will want to accept the student they want to accept, and a lot of that involves having students who are lower income backgrounds and who are going to make their school more interesting, more diverse, and who deserve to be at their school, at least from my perspective, because they haven't had the same opportunities. If affirmative action gets eliminated, it gets taken down, as we suspected, seems to be the direction in which things are going. There will be a very difficult new precedent that will be established for colleges on this ground. And there's a very strong argument that colleges are going to want to be even more elliptical and vague about the processes they use, because the less elliptical and vague they are, the more data that's out there, the more susceptible they are, the more likely it is for there to be a lawsuit like there was against Harvard in this famous thing with the with this Asian student who is filing a lawsuit, has been filing a lawsuit for reverse discrimination. So that's a speculative claim, and I think that there's definitely a cultural element to this, and there's a legal element to this. But for practical purposes of your student, really, it's use tests as a hedge against, to minimize your downside risk. Use them to increase your admissions odds, especially given what colleges are actually saying about the importance of them, that they are taking them seriously, that they are as important or as predictive of AC or GPAs as your college GPAs as your GPA is. And given the fact that the data suggests that you're 1.8 times as likely or so, almost twice as likely to be accepted if you have a test as if you don't have a test. And that's a big difference. I mean, that's as big of a difference as as an early decision would make. I mean, it's even bigger probably actually than an early decision versus regular decision. And use the test score to take pressure off of yourself and off of other areas of the application. If your GPA is low, if you don't have a lot of extracurricular activities that are really prominent, especially like in community service, or if you're not the best essayist in the world, test scores can make up for some of those things. And then, of course, the final thing, again, sort of this idea of having a lot of tools in your arsenal, that you can use the test for some schools, but not others. So if you meet the 25th percentile, you can submit selectively. And my hope, I think that the reason to take this seriously in general, that's probably the strongest reason, that you want to be applying to at least some schools where you would be in the 25th percentile, even if you're not yet, because that also is a signifier of the kinds of schools, perhaps, to which you should be applying in the first place. So you don't want to enter on any risks, especially in an era of yield protection, of colleges denying you because they think that you're in that 12.5 percentile or the 6.25 percentile or whatever that might be. So be careful on that as well. I have a former student here, Zach Sharp, who did very well at the University of Chicago. He was in a class of 2025. And I think one of the things about this process is that there's no one better to talk to about this than actual students. Like, they're actually in the trenches. Like, they are in college, they went through this, And they did it, Zach did it extraordinarily successfully, got into early decision at the University of Chicago, his first choice, and is now thriving there with a very high GPA. And more importantly, he's really enjoying himself and getting a lot of meaning out of it. If there were an opportunity to have Zach do the whole thing, I think in some ways Zach probably would have more credibility than anybody. Students like, not Zach individually, but students, people like Zach, people who are students, right? And we do have this ambassador program for that reason, because when you make college decisions, students who are at that college, who knows who, it's like, there are a lot of, you get something from people who are actually living it, right? They are living the college experience right now. So they're very good people. College students at the kind of schools you're looking at are very good students to talk to. So I will stop there, leave it to Zach. Zach, thank you for coming.
And yeah, thanks, Joe, for the introduction and all that, and the praise. Appreciate it. Yeah. So I know you're all kind of here to kind of to learn about the kind of the college admissions process, and I know that's something that was very intimidating when I was going through it, and so I'm always happy to like come and kind of speak about that a little bit. So in regards to like actually like taking the tests, these standardized tests are incredibly intimidating, and they're kind of designed and kind of like to be that way. That's something why I kind of started working out with Joe on this kind of stuff. So like I remember when I took the ACT for the very first time, I think I scored like something like a 24. It was not like where I kind of like wanted my scores to be, but it's something these tests are something that you can actually improve on, right? They're really meant to be I like to kind of think of them like they're like a game, right? You can like something that you can improve on with like by learning the strategies and learning the tips and tricks of the trade in order to kind of get that. And then by working out with Joe and all that, I was able to move my score up to about to a 33, which was like a significant improvement.
One question away from a 34. Literally one question.
I know. If I had just answered like one more question right on the science section, it would have been a 34. Oh, that was really, really crushing. But there's got to be a cutoff somewhere. So
yeah. I'm joking. That's great. Yeah. And what were you had said that you have friends. So Chicago, one of the reasons it's interesting to have Zach on is that Zach graduated in 2021,
yeah.
Right? But took the ACT, did prep with us in 2019. So you think, oh, well, he had to do prep. Well, Zach always knew he didn't want to go to the University of Chicago, and University of Chicago was test optional. So the world test optional for Zach and for the students who are at Chicago did exist. And I think most of the students who did prep probably did prep in 2020. So the fact that Zach is at Chicago is not simply it's actually relevant here because that was Chicago's test optional, has been test optional all the time.
Yeah, and just for that fact, like knew I wanted to go. I really kind of considered like whether or not I actually really needed to take the test, right? That was something I was like, they're test optional. I can maybe just get by on my grades, right? And after kind of like really kind of doing like basically kind of diving into the research, both talking Joe, doing other like research online, talking to my own college counselor at my high school, I found that like it was really better just to take the test, right? Because you're just, there's so many factors involved in college admissions. It's something that's, the test is not going to be the one thing that determines that you get in, or neither will be any of these other factors. But it's something that like it can, if you do really well and you're able to get a really good score, it can really boost you in that process. And that's something I kind of like, I found out, like when I came here, I kind of like, talked to a lot of my friends, about, well, hey, did you do test optional? Everyone I know that came here submitted scores. Everyone, and then not even apart from that, every other friend I have that went to, any sort of like top 20 school. So my friends at Princeton, Brown, Stanford, MIT, and Yale, they all submitted scores. And, every friend that I do know that I have that I'm close with that like didn't submit scores, didn't actually get into a top 20. So like, again, there's like a ton of like different factors that go between, each of those students and like, and everyone into the, what colleges review when they take a look at you. But I found that like test scores were like a really significant boost. And I feel that strongly that they are to your profile. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't, yeah, thanks, Zach. I think in doing this, there's a risk. I know everybody knows this is going to be recorded and all of that, but like there's a risk that you hear about so I don't want to, so this is not a sales pitch. This is I run a test prep company, and Zach, came on having great scores and going to Chicago, but this is so we have a whole area of, we're fully integrated college prep service. We do a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with tests. And we actually offer a fair amount of advice to parents around tests, sometimes encouraging them not to take the test, not to go beyond a certain level, right? Or not, in some cases, not even to take the test occasionally, not very often, but occasionally, especially if there's a big disconnect. And so I think one of the things I want to just come back to is that, just briefly, is that this is not a moral, there's a moral component to this that is very complicated. And I've kind of touched on a little bit of it. Sort of some of my own politics around the fact that I think it, in some ways, I think there's a lot about the college process that's unfair. The ACT, SAT is included in that, is perhaps less unfair than some of the other parts of the college process, but the college process is extraordinarily, is rankly unfair, and needs to be transformed, or it needs to be adjusted in important ways. But I also want to say that like there are definitely situations in which going test optional would be helpful, and would be good, and despite the opportunism involved in the way the colleges have benefited from this or perceive it, in spite of the fact that we're a test prep company, in spite of a lot of these things, there are some really like humanistic reasons that test optional is potentially very rewarding. Not having to worry about the test can take a lot of pressure off. And I think what I've tried to suggest here is that it also can add pressure. And I think that's the part that is less well recognized, that it means that there's more pressure that's placed on the other parts of your application. And it means that because it's a balance, it's a Pareto efficient, or it's an equilibrium, right? So if it's unequal, like if there's less pressure on the test, that means more pressure has to be put on something else. If you feel pressure over the college process, your pressure is finite, and so and if one part of that pressure goes down, then the other part goes up. So that means that other thing would have to go up a lot, and so that puts a lot of pressure on the other parts of your application. And I think that these are things that all need to be considered more broadly. The most basic answer is create as many opportunities as you can. College is supposed to be about opportunities. It's about having fun, about learning about yourself, getting a good job. It's also about opportunities of all of those that involve all of those things, and learning how to think, of course. But the test provides opportunities. Anything you can do that provides additional opportunities I think is at least worth pursuing. So that's, I think, all we have. If there are questions or thoughts or comments, we can address some, but we've crossed that threshold of 55 minutes, which was the number we were thinking about when we started, and would love to hear anything from anybody, or we can leave it at that and hope that we've contributed something that goes beyond the cant and myth and sort of political sort of insipid, banal kind of political consensus or conversation around these things. We hope we've said something more than that, and because that's really all that's the important thing, right? there's a lot of stuff that is not said, or that is intended to be said, but said very badly. So if we contributed anything to that, to you feeling like you actually feel like you have some understanding or deeper understanding or more understanding, that we really appreciate it. And we are always around. You can contact us for any sort of services. And we look forward to seeing you guys again. Thanks again.